Ancient Romans in Tallinn. Julius, the Vagrant, and Tullius. A few years before the turn of the millennium, a date that caused no small amount of headache for the calendar sages, on an exceptionally hot June midday, when the ancient city walls of Tallinn, the town hall, and the cobblestones of the town hall square radiated heat, forcing citizens to seek out the shade, a solitary man caught the eyes of the wandering tourists. He had taken a seat on a bench at a beer kiosk on the edge of the square. The bench was crafted from thick, hewn planks and stained dark brown in a desperate bid for a medieval aesthetic. These benches were paired with long tables of the same style, capable of seating a dozen beer drinkers at a time. The man sat on the bench, undisturbed, reading a book. Only his facial expressions betrayed his shifting emotions and sensitive soul. His mouth would twitch into a smirk as he read, then his expression would take on an ironic shade, occasionally flashing with undisguised contempt. Before him sat a beer glass, filled to the brim. It seemed he had forgotten to even take a sip. The man was no longer young, yet not too old. Kind-hearted people call this stage of life the golden middle age. His features were regular, with high black eyebrows and a handsome Roman nose with a slight bridge. The shape of his lips suggested a time when their kiss was a cherished gift to many a girl. His hair was more blonde than brown, slightly curled with silver showing at the temples. His general expression was pleasant but somewhat harsh. A noticeable wrinkle adorned each cheek, as if a weary peasant returning from the plow at sunset had let his one-horse plow drag across an unplowed fallow field. His wide-collared, short-sleeved shirt allowed passing female citizens to glimpse an athletic build and a straight back. By appearance, one might have taken him for a lifelong, educated city dweller who, lost in his book, had forgotten the world, the scorching sun, and his beer. But an attentive observer would have surely noticed a discordance in his physical appearance. His hands. Sun-browned, with thick fingers like two branching stump roots, they held the book gently and turned the pages with care. Based on those hands, an expert could say without error that this was no lifelong urbanite, but a first-generation city man. Yes, here sat the urbanized descendant of an eternal peasant. One who, in the 1960s, had fled the impoverished collective farm of his home, acquired an education through long years of night school, and remained in the city. He was a small but vital former fragment of the dwindling rural folk, the roots of every nation, who in his current state provided the growth for the urbanizing contingent. Yet despite his serious demeanor and educated look, the countryman still sat within him. The rustic humor that occasionally made a more refined table crowd squirm with discomfort rather than laugh. The sometimes reckless actions, the somewhat simple and trusting attitude toward people. This was his essence. The man's first name was Julius. Country folk introduced themselves to strangers primarily by their first names. Surnames were usually only uttered on formal occasions, such as when the parents or relatives of a bride and groom met for the first time. Since we face no such ceremony in meeting him, we too shall limit ourselves to his first name. The name Julius undoubtedly sounds old-fashioned, but it can't be helped. The name was given at a time when the old names were still in use, just as names with a newer ring were beginning to emerge. This first-generation urbanite, and likewise first-generation intellectual named Julius, sat on the bench reading his book. He had bought it for 10 kroons from an old crone. The pensioner crone was hawking 3 books at the corner of the town hall, the last remnants of her nearly 100-volume library that had once decorated the wall unit shelves of every self-respecting citizen, alongside various knickknacks. The man bought 1 book from her, leaving her with 2. But the sun was only at its zenith. Let us hope that by evening, those 2 books were also sold. As mentioned, the man was deep in his book. The book told of the life and times of ancient Rome. Julius read quickly, his eyes skimming over the pages and skipping lines. It was a first acquaintance, to be followed later by a more serious study. Though he read superficially, he still formed some idea of the lives and deeds of the ancient Romans. At the same time, many of their acts and dealings raised questions and remained incomprehensible. But has anyone ever truly been able to fully understand another person's strivings, desires, and dreams? Julius read, Mithridates, king of all Asia Minor, sent armies to Europe, inciting the Egyptians, Numidians, and other nations to unite in war against Rome. Mithridates was an expert in medicine and poisons and knew how to prepare effective antidotes. At the banquet table, he loved to drain poisoned goblets, offering them also to his chosen guests. After emptying the cups, the guests would give up the ghost, writhing on the floor in terrible agony, a sight that offered Mithridates boundless amusement. Those in Mithridates' inner circle praised the king for his witty jest. The tribune of the plebs, Servius Sulpicius, a brazen demagogue, proposed a bill that established lifelong privileges for his family, relatives, and their descendants. The consuls and the Senate argued fiercely against it, demanding the same privileges for themselves. Should their demands not be met, they threatened to declare every day a public holiday, so that the People's Assembly could not meet to approve Servius Sulpicius's bill. Sulla declared himself dictator of the Roman state and ended the squabbles between the parties by ordering the total destruction of his opponents based on blacklists prepared well in advance. It was primarily the wealthy Romans who found themselves on these blacklists. Their property was confiscated and distributed among Sulla's supporters, thus creating a class of nouveaux riches loyal to Sulla. After Sulla's death, the confiscations were annulled and property was returned to the former owners and their heirs. However, since the former owners and their heirs had been slaughtered, new power sharks began to wheel and deal with the lands and houses of the dead. At this point, it should be noted that the reader should not be too angry with Sulla, for Sulla was likely not the first, and certainly not the last, to carry out the grabbing and redistribution of wealth in such a fashion. For this, various pretexts and high-sounding names were invented: Inquisition, Reformation, Reduction, Restitution, Enlightened Absolutism, the French Revolution, the October Revolution, and a prominent achievement of modern times, a crossbreed of reduction and restitution, perestroika. This list is certainly neither complete nor final. Julius would likely have remained alone with his book, as polite citizens did not wish to disturb a reader, and moreover, they were seeking a more shaded beer kiosk. But an unpredictable vagrant, who was in need of company, but actually beer, slipped modestly onto the end of the bench next to Julius. The vagrant settled himself and began to stare fixedly at Julius's beer glass, much like a dog crouching by a table stares at a slice of sausage on a plate. Lost in his book, Julius would likely not have noticed his sudden companion at all, had the specific stench emanating from his neighbor not forced him first to wrinkle his nose and then to look for its source. Discovering the vagrant beside him, one could tell from Julius's expression that this individual piqued his curiosity more than his resentment. Nor did Julius fail to notice the vagrant's fixed gaze on the beer glass. Julius ordered another beer, placed it in front of the vagrant, signaled toward the mug with his eyes, and delved back into his book with the obvious desire to finish the chapter. But he was mistaken. He was no longer the master of the situation. The vagrant's sudden transformation forced him to stop reading and begin a dialogue with his table-mate. The vagrant had become visibly more animated, his face lit with joy and delight. With great eagerness, he set about offering a favor in return. No point wasting beer like that. You got to give the beer 2 squirts of dichlorvos. Only then do you get a real drink fit for a man. An explanation for the reader. Dichlorvos was a highly effective insecticide widely used during the Soviet era in aerosol spray cans. Now they lay in scrap heaps, and experts used them to give beer the necessary kick. With quick movements, the vagrant fished a dichlorvos can out of a filthy plastic bag filled with all sorts of rubbish and began to explain animatedly. You gotta be real precise with the dichlorvos. For example, 3 squirts in a beer glass and it's toes up. You ain't getting back up. But 1 squirt isn't enough. 2 squirts is just right, but only if the dosage is spot on. The squirt shouldn't last longer than 1/4 of a second. But the trouble is that mankind hasn't yet invented a machine that knows how to puff the right portion into a glass. Only human instinct and experience help here. Noticing his companion's astonished look and sensing his fear, the vagrant set about reassuring Julius. Don't you worry, it won't hurt. I'm an experienced squirter. Lately, nobody's kicked the bucket or writhed on the ground in pain on account of my squirts. Hearing this, Julius remembered his post-war childhood on the home farm in Voruma. He was a boy of about 6. His mother was shaking white DDT pesticide onto the cabbage heads. The cabbages looked as if they had been dusted with flour. The cabbage worms wriggled for a bit, and then lay still, curled up. Do the cabbage worms feel pain too? Julius had asked his mother. His mother merely shrugged in response, appearing annoyed by Julius's foolish question. The vagrant first pulled his own beer glass closer. He readied the dichlorvos can, his filthy index finger with black under the nail resting on the button. He focused for a moment, his expression showing boundless gravity and total responsibility, and then made 2 quick successive presses with his fingertip. Vertst, vertst. After that, he sighed with relief and satisfaction. One could say without error that the vagrant hit the bullseye. The operation was a success. Having already performed the successful procedure, the vagrant confidently pulled Julius's beer glass closer, focused, and again, 2 perfectly timed squirts were heard. This time, Julius's mug was also in order. The vagrant shook the can by his ear, apparently checking if any of the good stuff remained for next time. He then stuffed the squirt can back into the plastic bag and adjusted it between his legs, as if fearing someone might steal the bag and its valuable contents. To your health, the vagrant said with a polite toast, clinked Julius's glass resting on the table, smacked his lips a few times as if preparing them to receive the nectar, and lifted the glass to his lips. His Adam's apple began to move up and down at a steady, rhythmic pace, and the beer flowed into the vagrant's throat. Ah! The vagrant belched contentedly and placed the empty glass on the table. The vagrant signaled with a nod toward Julius's glass. Julius lifted the glass, smacked his lips in imitation of the vagrant, and without wasting time, drained the beer glass in one go, his Adam's apple moving only twice. The vagrant watched him intently and with approval. Ah! Julius echoed the vagrant's sound. For a while they sat in silence, watching each other's expressions. Then the vagrant's head gave a few vague jerks. He tried to straighten his back, but then collapsed onto the table, sprawled out. Soon, a steady snoring was heard, indecently interrupted by the snuffling of the vagrant's snotty nose. Julius tried to continue his reading, but his vision blurred. The letters rolled away and vanished into a fog. He lifted his head to give his eyes some rest, let his gaze sweep across the town hall square and then back to the book. But he had lost his sense of reality. In his head, everything was muddled. Ancient Rome, the town hall, the city of Tallinn, centuries, millennia, all had melted into one vague millennium. The Democrat, Sullius, a functionary of the Optimate Party, had just raised his sword to strike off the head of a brazen oracle from the opposing party when Julius's gaze was caught by an unexpected commotion at the main door of the town hall. From the town hall emerged the magistrate Tullius, whom the common folk simply called the mayor. The magistrate was surrounded by lictors, bundles of rods, fasces at their belts. Inside the bundle of the chief lictor, a submachine gun had been tucked. The magistrate's portly frame was covered by a purple toga adorned with colorful sequins and decorated with the medals of office. A numerous entourage exchanged fawning handshakes with the mayor, Jests were made, as is customary when a high official sets off on a long but pleasant holiday. Hovering around the magistrate was his youthful third wife, who seemed not to have found her proper place yet, whether to the right or left of her master. Unfortunately, this pleasant atmosphere was disturbed by a mob of free citizens gathered on the forum in front of the town hall. Shouting angrily and throwing stones against the walls of the town hall, they pointed toward the roof. Reluctantly, Tullius directed his gaze toward old Thomas spinning on the town hall tower, and then stood speechless, blinking foolishly. On the ridge of the roof, Lepidus was busy with slaves, workers, dismantling the town hall roof. At this point, the reader likely needs a small explanation. Tullius's fellow party member, Lepidus, had decided to take advantage of the mayor's soft character, party connections, and shared amusements involving common courtesans. Lepidus, a former Soviet-era construction worker, had decided to build additional floors with flat, tarred roofs onto all the houses in the old town, so that luxury apartments could be profitably rented out or sold. But to kill two birds with one stone, so to speak, and take the bull by the horns immediately, he resolved to start with the town hall roof. Tear down old Thomas, build a floor onto the town hall, and cover it with a flat, tarred roof. The rest would then follow like a hot knife through butter. Tullius was seized by a sudden, terrible rage. He shook his fist at Lepidus and shouted toward the roof, "Tempus edax, homo edacior." Time is gluttonous. Man is more gluttonous still. Lepidus shouted back from the roof, "Divide et impera, divide and rule. Dives qui fieri vult, et cito vult fieri." He who wishes to become rich wishes to do so quickly. Author's note: since in this society, besides Latin, the language of the common folk was also in use, the High Consul Popular had, under penalty of death, made it mandatory for all subordinates and superiors to translate their Latin speeches and expressions into the tongue of the common folk, so that no misunderstandings or resulting riots would occur. Tullius's sudden rage evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. Lepidus is one of the boys, after all, a fellow party member from the Populares. Construction work ennobles every man, and an extra floor on the town hall only brings honor to the city of Tallinn. Tullius decided that at the next great assembly of citizens, he would propose giving Lepidus the honorary title, Great Builder God Lepidus. As for the Finno-Ugric old Thomas, he's been perched there long enough. As they say, enough staring. Si vis amari, ama. If you wish to be loved, be loving. Manus manum lavat. One hand washes the other, Tullius muttered to himself in Latin, and using his mobile phone, called for his litter. While waiting for the litter, Tullius tried to play the man of the people, attempting to joke with the citizens, even buttering them up by shouting over the screaming crowd. Facile est imperium in bonis. It is easy to rule over good people. But the people continued to riot. A few eggs and rotten tomatoes flew in Tullius's direction. The situation was saved by the arrival of the litter. Mayor Tullius used a specific make and model of litter, a Jeep Land Rover with dark stone-proof windows and the license plate Tullius 1. Its motive power consisted of 8 slave bearers. Actually, such high-clearance vehicles were used by land-owning patricians, and the mayor seemingly had no need for such an off-roader, as he never left the boundaries of his pomerium. But as an ambitious slave only recently freed, mimicking the previous rulers, he felt an inner need to possess a vehicle no worse than the patricians, since nemo bene imperat, nisi qui parurit imperio. Only he who has previously been ruled can rule well. Tullius climbed panting into the litter. The bearers lifted it off the ground and prepared to start a jog. At the same moment, Tullius stopped them with a sharp oath. He had forgotten his young wife. Hop! The lass sprang into the litter and onto Tullius's lap, and the slaves set off at a light trot, their sandals swishing. In the process, the young wife's buxom breasts took on such a violent bouncing in time with the run that Tullius was forced to hold them with both hands, which caused some envy among the citizens. At this point, it must be clarified that Tullius was not heading on a holiday. His path led up the winding and steeply rising narrow Pic-Jalg Street toward Tumpea. He faced a speech before the Senate and the consuls. He was attempting to secure a budget allocation for the city from the state treasury. As the recent events at the town hall square showed, the citizens had already gone completely mad, attacking Tullius and his loyal party comrade Lepidus with stones. Additionally, they were stealing, carousing, hounding the mayor with all sorts of letters of complaint, and intruding into Tullius's private life. The citizens lacked entertainment, fistfights, football battles, Eurovision, in short, spectacles, or the circus. Habeat sibi, let them have their way, Tullius decided. Especially since Tallinn was already nearly 10 centuries old, yet not a single previous mayor had found money for a circus, for the people. But as the ancient Roman statesman Augustus said, panem et circenses, the people need bread and circuses. Tullius decided to pay off his own and his predecessors' debt to the people. Moreover, he was an ambitious and somewhat vain man who craved respect and esteem, the glorification of himself. At this point, one cannot fail to mention the magistrate's fondness for his secretaries. Often he chased scantily clad secretary girls across the marble floors of the town hall, who coquettishly hid behind the hall's columns. Dulce est desipere in loco. It is pleasant to be foolish at the right place and time. Fearing, however, that he might go unnoticed in the next world, and wishing to legitimize his adventures with women, he had already in his lifetime commissioned a massive funeral monument for himself, which bore the inscription, "I was the great magistrate. I bathed in abundance, and among all else I had magnificent secretary maidens." Every evening before retiring to bed, he visited the monument towering at the gate of his palace, placed a bouquet of flowers there, and whispered, for the comfort of his soul, like an evening prayer, "Exegi monumentum. I have erected a monument to myself." Tullius's litter, the Jeep Land Rover, vanished into the winding Vorome Street, then turned left, passing through the gate that separated the lower town from the district of the rulers, and began the ascent to Tumpea up the Pic-Jalg Street, which was extremely grueling for the slave-bearers. The crowd at the town hall square prepared to disperse peacefully, and there was reason for it. Tullius had set out to fulfill the people's will by taking steps toward building a circus. In addition to the above, the people had just been able to exercise their democratic freedom of speech at the recent forum, to scream at Tullius and at Lepidus climbing on the town hall roof and to pelt them with stones. One could peacefully leave the modest person of the mayor to attend to city business, but one small detail needs telling. As mentioned before, the buxom lass in the mayor's lap caused some envy among the townspeople. This is understandable and could be accepted, but there were particularly fawning citizens, wealthier grocers, poorer bankers, meager stockbrokers, and clever rogues who also wanted to drive their wives around like the mayor, while proudly holding on to the lass's breasts. Unfortunately, a proper litter cost a fortune, and such luxury could be afforded by only a few citizens. But a sycophant's ingenuity is boundless, and they found a solution. When passing the town hall windows, they would pick up their wives and carry them across the square, bowing humbly and respectfully toward the town hall windows. But, as in everything, unforeseen hitches occurred in this situation. A portly citizen with a grand air, contentedly waving his walking stick, marched along Kalasipa Street toward the town hall square, a corpulent spouse on his arm. Before stepping onto the square, the citizen stopped, spread his arms with the intention of picking up his spouse, but then suddenly stared at his wife with arms agape, as if seeing her for the first time. Having appraised his dear companion with a weighing gaze, the citizen waved his hand and turned aside into the Raikoja alleyway. The people called it the prison's neck, forgetting to take his little wife by the arm. At the same time, such a deceptive maneuver caused the citizen a sense of discomfort, and the name of the street brought depression and weighed on his conscience, reminding many a citizen of a possible, more than well-deserved residence in the prison of the town hall cellar. In certain circles of the citizenry, a decision was ripening to end the custom of wife-carrying, which, however, presupposed a vote of no confidence against the mayor. Despite the vote of no confidence ripening in some circles, incited primarily by the optimates, the eternal enemies of the populares, who exploited the feelings of those who owned corpulent wives, Tullius's litter reached the top of the high hill, which was adorned by a magnificent temple, the seat of the Senate and the consuls. By the gilded Tumpeldik, the hill latrine situated next to the Orthodox Church, a crack of Tullius's whip on the lead slave's back forced the litter to stop. Tullius's young wife jumped nimbly from his lap, the slave-bearers helped Tullius out of the litter, and for a moment he stood as if in confusion. Tullius could not decide whether to visit the latrine immediately or postpone the action. "To hell with it. Soul troubles first. Body troubles can wait." He waved his hand like a statesman and set his steps toward the government temple. On the square in front of the temple, which the common folk called the Castle Square, swarmed a vast hive of barbarians. Foreigners. The barbarians pushed in a continuous stream through the temple's main door, creating a scuffle with those exiting and cursing among themselves. Meanwhile, more greedy foreign advisors kept arriving on the square. Celtic Highlanders in checkered skirts had arrived to advise on the privatization of the railways. Russians, sweating in high monomock caps and sable coats, toiled up the Tumpea Street, advisors on east-west transit with the goal of hacking a window into Europe. Arab nobles had left their camels by the Kiek in the Cook Wall to chew on wormwood, while they themselves headed along the steeply rising Komandandi Road to meet with the consuls regarding the privatization of sand dunes. A long column of descendants of the original inhabitants of Palestine had taken over the entire Falji Road, occasionally wiping sweat from their brows with their sleeves and adjusting their pitch-black caps. They ascended the hill, panting, hurrying to give good advice on the art of laundering money. It is said that good advice is expensive. Proverbs truly hold true, especially where they are followed. The entire state budget was disappearing into the pockets of the advisors, though there hadn't been a penny's worth of benefit yet. Some domestic advisors even claimed, likely exaggerating out of deep envy, that the advisors' business plan didn't even envision a profit for the state. But domestic rumors cannot be believed, for fama crescit eundo. Everyone adds something to what they hear. Tullius pushed himself through the mass of advisors, men in militari, by force of arms. The lictors accompanying him occasionally snapped their bundles of rods to the right and left against the flanks of the more arrogant ones to make way for Tullius. He barely squeezed through the door of the government temple. The chief lictor was even forced to show the barrel of the submachine gun from within the rods to a particularly greedy, shoving advisor. Tullius jingled his medals of office before the girl at the reception desk. The girl snapped to attention, raised her hand to her ear, and winked at Tullius. Tullius had spent the previous night with her, the fatigue of which was still in his limbs. Tullius strode up to the second floor along a staircase decorated with a purple carpet with golden embroidery. Reaching the second floor, he turned left and entered the Senate session hall. "Vivat Popular! Long live the Popular!" He saluted his party boss, who sat as High Consul on the High Presidium throne. "Salve, Tullius I. Welcome, Tullius I," the boss replied to his party comrade with equal respect. With a contemptuous wave of his hand, Popular chased the Optimate Oracle Sullius from the rostrum, who had already been performing demagoguery for 2 hours with no end in sight. Sullius's speech was disjointed and hollow, meaningless hair-splitting. Perhaps this was because in his youth, during sword practice, his clumsiness had angered the trainer, who struck Sullius flat across the forehead with the sword, to stimulate his untalented pupil even slightly. This lesson was of little use and left no mark at all, save for a blood-red patch on Sullius's forehead that remained for life. Sullius repeated incomprehensible words and expressions on the rostrum, lining them up and rephrasing them in various ways, while expressing nothing new and offering no fresh ideas. In his incomprehensible and senseless speech, he used some barbarian words that sounded neither like Latin nor the common tongue. Perestroika, glasnost, socialism's second wind, socialism with a human face, facing the people. Such a performance angered the senators. Apparently, Sullius wanted to imply that they were facing the people not with their faces, but with some other part of their anatomy. Tullius was called to the rostrum and ordered to present his request. Tullius began his speech, bowing respectfully toward the High Consul Popular. "O all you judging and merciful consuls, wise senators, mighty warlords, great God Populara, ruler of the lower and upper Emayugi, curber of Lake Papus, keeper of the great Munamegi, defender of the Viru gates, saint of Lenema and the islands. All you who have come here to this temple, listen to me, Magistrate Tullius." Tullius presented his business plan to build a city circus because the people demand it. Panem et circenses, bread and circuses. He described the gathering of people at the town hall square where the people cheeringly send him on his way to express the people's will before the Senate. Tullius suggested the site for the circus be Gallows Hill, Volame, in the center of the city, from which the gallows should be moved elsewhere, to a less visible place so it would not needlessly frighten honest citizens. But the Optimates raised a ruckus, stomping their feet and pelting Tullius with whatever objects were at hand. They were always against it, no matter what bill the Populares proposed. Tullius tried to argue back, looking for arguments, but suddenly felt that he had to finish his speech post-haste. He had, after all, acted unwisely by not tending to his bodily needs at the hill latrine before ascending the rostrum. And only now did he understand, for empta dolore docet experientia. Experience bought with pain teaches how wise and practical it is to build a latrine next to a church. Bodily needs first, soul troubles can wait. Tullius's pause for thought was exploited by High Consul Popular. "Great Tullius, for the fear of the townspeople the gallows must remain in place and be raised to the heavens, higher than Gallows Hill. The Gauls, Germans, and Scandinavians are planning a joint bank. They are building a sky-high bank temple on Gallows Hill and erecting the gallows on top of it. I can be certain that the sight of the gallows at such a heavenly height will take away the citizens' appetite for misdeeds and leave the gallows empty, while simultaneously reminding the citizens constantly of the debt burden weighing upon them and the need to repay their loans. I have spoken, great Tullius. Build the circus building in another place, and fiat voluntas tua, let thy will be done." Magistrate Tullius rushed down from the rostrum, bowed to the Senate on the run, and a moment later he was seen fiercely and impatiently stuffing coins into the slot of the hill latrine's door. We, however, return to the Senate session, as we are in no hurry. The Optimate demagogue had, as mentioned before, been chased from the rostrum. Since the rostrum never stands empty, after Tullius's lightning-fast departure, it was occupied by a new orator, the General Secretary of the Communist Party. Propped against the speaker's podium was the immense belly of a bald citizen with thick cheeks but a determined physiognomy, Senator Claudius. His reddened face and excessive self-confidence pointed to the fact that he had just arrived from a rich dinner table, knocked back 200 grams of Russian vodka before the meal, and now desperately wanted to perform. Claudius waved his fists violently and his mouth sprayed spit as he promised to show everyone Kuska's mother, Kuskinu Mati. This phrase sounded neither like Latin nor the common tongue and remained incomprehensible to the Senate, but everyone understood. Senator Claudius was not joking about this. But let us rather listen to Senator Claudius's performance.
O most honorable senators, listen to me, the god Claudius. The Communist Party solemnly declares, this generation shall have the fortune of living in the time of communism. Our loyal party comrade, the specter of communism, prowling through the European Union, has arrived at the gates of Tallinn, promising abundance and prosperity to all. Arise, ye prisoners of starvation. Panty-liners with wings ensure a good feeling. The creation of a new world has begun. The Communist Party is the honor, mind, and conscience of mankind. Liberty, fraternity, equality. Proletarians of all countries, unite. Oh, senators, listen to our programs. The food program. Eat and drink as much as you can and as much as your head can carry. The housing program. An apartment, a house, and a garage for a litter for everyone. The IME program. The People's Enterprises. Everything for the benefit of man, all in the name of his happiness. High Consul Populaire finally grew tired of Senator Claudius's slogans and ended the Communist Party orator's speech, first for some reason in the common tongue, and then in Latin. Enough of this rubbish, nec plus ultra. Emilius and Berenike.
A slight clarity formed in Julius's mind. The letters took on a more distinct shape, and he attempted to continue reading. Antony summoned Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, to Tarsus. Cleopatra arrived there upon a magnificent ship with purple sails. Antony wished to demand an account from Cleopatra as to why she had supported Brutus and Cassius in Rome. In Tarsus, Cleopatra invited Antony to visit her ship. On board, Cleopatra led Antony into her cabin. At this point, Julius's vision blurred again, but he tried to pursue the theme, that is, to read without actually reading. In the cabin, Cleopatra let her tunic fall to the floor, tossed her panties and bra onto a chair, sprinkled intoxicating myrrh upon her nipples, and, teasing Antony with a playful flick of her tongue, leaped onto the feather pillows lying beneath a golden-hued canopy. Antony cast aside his automatic, sword and shield upon the floor and caught Cleopatra in his embrace. Julius's vision seemed to clear, and he was once again able to follow the book's text. Antony remained with Cleopatra the entire night. Antony fell in love with Cleopatra, although some historians claim that his attitude toward her was primarily driven by economic interests. But Cleopatra was a beautiful woman, and falling in love, or at least an amorous affair, is never excluded in such a case. When Cleopatra returned to Egypt, Antony followed her. Antony completely forgot the affairs of state. He washed Cleopatra's feet and wrote her love letters, which they then read together. When they grew weary of lovemaking, they amused one another with vigorous carousing in the company of dancing girls, watched the sword fights of slaves, or attended theatrical performances. Octavius landed his forces in Egypt at Alexandria. Antony's warriors defected to Octavius's side. Cleopatra fled to the palace and ordered the doors to be firmly shut. Antony, believing Cleopatra had taken her own life, attempted to kill himself, but succeeded only in inflicting a grievous belly wound. Cleopatra ordered the dying Antony to be hoisted by ropes over the wall and into the temple. Antony died with his head resting on Cleopatra's knees. Cleopatra had her faithful servants bring her a basket of figs, in which a cobra was hidden. Cleopatra locked herself in the bedroom, allowed the cobra to bite her, and died. At this, Julius was overcome by dizziness once more. It felt as though he himself had been struck by a snakebite, its venom threatening to rob him not only of his sight but of his reason. Julius strained his willpower to avoid collapsing next to the vagrant. He straightened his back, swaying from side to side as if in a dream, and finally achieved balance. He opened his eyes and saw a strange figure moving across the town hall square. Walking diagonally from the end of Kulasapa Street toward Aptigi Street was a young man in a black toga, a bunch of wilted lilacs in his hand. His face bore the look of a martyr. It seemed as if he had come from the other world, or had just finished dancing the Danse Macabre in St. Nicholas's Church. In any case, it was clear he was not coming from paradise, nor was his state particularly rosy. He traveled on foot, without the use of even the cheapest litter. This individual was the former treasurer, or rather, the chairman of the board of a former support fund. This was Master Emilius. What troubled Emilius? What was the cause of his sorrow and tormented state? To get ahead of the story, one must say that in Emilius's case, it was not a matter of snakebite, nor methanol or diclovos poisoning. He was tormented by the loss of a villa worth 100 million kroons. But now is truly the right time to tell everything in order, from the very beginning, to relate to the reader the sad tale of Emilius and Berenike ipso facto, on the basis of the fact itself. Master Emilius, a 30-year-old citizen and a member of the Populares party, had been appointed treasurer, a quaestor of the support fund, on the recommendation of his influential party comrade, Magistrate Tullius. Such a decision was not reached at a public assembly or a Senate session. All decisions related to the distribution of money, lands, property, and high offices were made in the back rooms of the ruling party's private villas. Recommending Emilius for this lucrative post, Tullius addressed his party comrades with a speech praising Emilius, highlighting his extraordinary abilities. To give his words special weight, he concluded his address in Latin. Ex fructibus arborem cognoscimus, ex cantu avem. We know the tree by its fruit, the bird by its song. The support fund provided extensive low-interest loans to members and supporters of the Populares. The party members knew well, the more capital placed into their supporters' ventures, the greater their pressure on every statesman individually. Emilius's secretary was a 20-year-old slender maiden named Berenike, with deep blue eyes and long blonde hair. Her goal in life was to secure a husband whose wallet would provide a carefree existence. Her future husband had to be so rich that a wife could proudly tell her friends, "My husband is so rich, I don't even know how to fry eggs." Thus did the blonde Berenike, a distant descendant of the Vikings, envision her upcoming happy life as a married woman. Every morning, Berenike greeted her boss with the gaze of one in love. Her breasts beneath transparent tulle rose and fell, trembling with excitement, exuding the aroma of myrrh and other stimulating substances. But the scent of love went unnoticed by Emilius, nor did the feverish quivering of Berenike's breasts capture his attention. Thus the days passed, then weeks, and weeks became months. Berenike began to fear she would never achieve her goal. She would likely have fallen into melancholy or even attempted to take her own life, had a divine thought not sparked in her head. A man is not just a man, that is, a wallet, but he is also a male. One morning, just as Emilius opened his office door and his gaze habitually settled on the secretary's desk, he was no longer greeted by high breasts and deep blue eyes. This sudden deprivation of the morning body language greeting created a void in Emilius's soul, and only now did he realize how much it meant to him. But a moment later, a small pinkish patch appeared before his eyes, moving and groaning softly. At the same time, he noticed Berenike's breasts, her flushed face, a shock of blonde hair fallen over it, and dark eyes watching Emilius unmovingly from between her legs. "What happened, Berenike?" Emilius cried out in alarm.
"My fountain pen fell,"
Berenike replied with a pathetic voice, continuing to clamber under the desk, her little rear end in pink panties sticking up. Emilius tossed his briefcase onto the sofa and threw himself prone onto the floor beside Berenike under the desk, being manfully helpful and caring. For a while they searched together,
Then suddenly Berenike squeezed the lost pen in her palm, but she already knew. In her other palm was Emilius. Berenike allowed Emilius to lift her to her feet, pressing herself against his chest and entwining her arms around his neck. Emilius placed Berenike gently on her feet, awkwardly untangled her arms, and, grabbing his briefcase from the sofa, vanished quickly into his office. There he sat, silent and unmoving, without even demanding his usual morning coffee and mail. Berenike showed her own brand of modesty, being careful not to be pushy or tactless. The romance required time to develop. For half the day, Emilius did not show his face. After lunch, he left work. He summoned his litter, a Mercedes-Benz Lux six-bearer model, and with a crunch of sandals, the litter surged forward. Emilius sped off to a backroom meeting of the Populares. The next morning, Emilius placed a bouquet of charmingly fragrant bird cherry blossoms, just come into bloom, before his secretary. Berenike cast a grateful glance at Emilius, blushed modestly, and hid her face in the blossoms, smiling mysteriously all the while. So it lasted the entire month of May, bird cherry blossoms every morning, Emilius's awkwardness, and Berenike's smile hidden in the flowers, though it began to show shades of worry. When June arrived and everything continued as before, only with the bird cherry replaced by a bunch of lilacs, it was clear to Berenike that she had to take the next small step toward her happiness. It only remained to decide what that step would be, and how far-reaching. But chance, or rather fate, decided for Berenike. One morning, a week before Midsummer Day, Emilius stepped through the door at 9 a.m. as usual, handed Berenike the bunch of lilacs, and vanished into his office even faster than usual. With a habitual motion, Berenike stuck her nose into the lilacs, but this time something pricked her. Nestled in the bunch was a tastefully designed invitation, an invitation to a midsummer bonfire. On Midsummer Eve, Berenike rose early and stepped out into the yard, unclad, save for a thin, transparent white nightgown. She felt with her whole body the crisp freshness of the early morning air, which the rising sun had already begun to warm slightly. Berenike ran barefoot through the dew-covered yard and washed her eyes with dew. It keeps one beautiful and healthy. Berenike splashed water high into the air from the wash trough in the yard. The water fell, glistening in the morning sun, onto Berenike's hair, shoulders, and nightgown. Water purifies body and soul, and the splashing of water also prevents an overly drought-stricken summer. The rituals performed, Berenike was ready to return inside, but she hesitated. She was waiting for the larks. Whoever sees two larks warbling close together in the sky can expect good fortune. And as if in answer to the expectations of Berenike's love-struck soul, the warbling of larks was suddenly heard. High under the blue, cloudless sky, Berenike noticed two larks close together, hanging in one spot and warbling to one another. Berenike rushed into the house, embraced her mother and father happily and radiantly, and vanished into her room. Her mother and father looked at each other in bewilderment. But then they understood. The song of the larks was coming through the open kitchen window. Emilius was awakened by a morning ray of dawn peeking through the bedroom window. He dressed quickly, popped a piece of last night's pie into his mouth to stave off the birds, and went outside. The dewy grass moistened his sneakers and pant legs, but he didn't even notice. The summer morning and the rising sun made his heart light and happy. Emilius walked a circuit around his house and stuck rowan branches into every corner of the plot so that weeds would not grow on the patch of land. Then, with a creak, he opened the shed door, grabbed an axe, and went out the gate. Having closed the gate properly behind him, he turned onto the path that led through the dewy meadow of tall grass to a small copse bordered by numerous young, white-trunked birches. Emilius chose the smallest and, in his opinion, most beautiful among them, and felled 5 birch saplings, silently asking forgiveness from each tree. Then Emilius took out a pocket knife and cut fresh branches from the birches, being careful not to harm them too much. Having gathered a sufficient amount for a sauna whisk, Emilius tied them into a bundle and fixed them to his belt. Emilius tucked the axe into his belt beside the birch whisk and was ready to hoist the birch saplings onto his back when he suddenly heard the warbling of larks high in the blue sky, occasionally glinting in the sun. 2 larks sang side by side. Emilius watched them for a while, chuckled to himself, then gathered the birches onto his back and headed joyfully toward the house. At home, Emilius opened the windows. The entire house was filled with the scent of lilacs, which mingled with the mysterious forest aroma of the fresh birches placed in the rooms. After a small breakfast, Emilius set to work at the sauna. He selected the finest and driest birch logs, some of which needed splitting with the axe. He carried them in his arms to the sauna and readied the stove. After that, he clattered about the shed with buckets, and having found a couple of watertight pails, hurried to the well. The high well sweep vanished into the well. The deep well echoed Emilius's grunting, and then a pail of clean, refreshing water appeared from the well. Emilius first took a good draught of refreshing water over the rim of the pail, and then poured it into the buckets. He carried water until the sauna boiler was filled to the brim, and poured several pails into the cold water tub. Now the sauna stove could be lit. An hour later, Emilius readied himself for the sauna. With a washcloth and whisk under his arm, and a small keg of homebrew in hand, he strode toward the sauna. In the sauna, Emilius threw several ladles of water onto the stones, whisked himself until he was lobster red, grunting and puffing all the while, and finally rinsed himself with several caps of water drawn from the cold water tub. Then he sat on the threshold to cool himself, sipped his beer, pulled a random handful of leaves from the birch whisk, made a secret wish, and counted the leaves. If the number was even, the secret wish was destined to come true. Emilius had an even number. Having drained his beer cap, Emilius began to dress. He pulled on a linen undershirt and long white underpants of the same material. He wished to be dressed like the men of old on Midsummer Night. Emilius waited impatiently for evening, for the meeting with Berenike. Finally, when the sun had already lost its brilliance and the shadows of the maple and oak trees bordering the yard covered the entire lawn, Emilius set off for his meeting with Berenike. He carefully chose a shirt, checked for the umpteenth time if his trouser crease was straight enough, and combed his hair first one way, then the other, wishing to create a new hairstyle that would surprise Berenike. Finally, he left everything as it was and rushed to the meeting, by the great stone in the Rocca al Mare Forest Park. Here, in the beautiful park by the seashore, a giant midsummer bonfire was to take place. Berenike was already at the great stone. Wishing to surprise Emilius, she had covered the sacrificial stone with a modest spread, fruit, strawberries, a few tasty pieces of meat for a man, some slices of bread. Between them she had placed a bottle of red wine and decorated it with wildflowers. Emilius kissed Berenike gently and modestly on the cheek. Berenike was somehow shy and hesitant. They sat side by side on the stone. Occasionally, Berenike popped strawberries into Emilius's mouth, while Emilius offered Berenike wine, which they sipped from the bottle. For a moment they fell silent, each turning in thought to the departed souls and the spirits, as if asking forgiveness for their happiness. Upon leaving, they left a little food and red wine on the stone for the spirits. The midsummer bonfire had already been lit. The people were singing and dancing. The swing swung high, and the boys kept adding momentum, drawing forth frightened shrieks and joyful laughter from the girls. Accordions, bagpipes, whistles, and mouth harps played all together and separately. Occasionally, only an endless roar was heard. The people kept streaming in from every direction. It seemed the entire city of Tallinn was rushing here. The first-generation urbanites had come in folk costumes. Experts could notice former islanders from Saaremaa, Muhu, and Hiiumaa, as well as the urbanized descendants of farmers from Sakalamaa and Lennamaa, Tartumaa, Järvamaa, Polvamaa, and Voormaa, East and West Virmaa, and Harjumaa.
Plowing the fresh grass with the 8 pairs of sandals of his Jeep Land Rover, Magistrate Tullius I turned proudly onto the bonfire grounds, a young lass in his lap, accompanied by a gang of already beer-soaked lictors. Then the call of fanfares was heard. A marathon runner burst onto the bonfire grounds and announced the arrival of High Consul Popular. A moment later, High Consul Popular's enormous armored litter with dark, stone-proof windows sped out from between the park trees. He was followed by a whole troop of advisors, Celtic Highlanders in checkered skirts, Russians in high monomock caps and sable coats. Arab nobles sat proudly atop camels, followed on foot by the descendants of the original inhabitants of Palestine in their pitch-black caps. As a colorful company, singing, dancing, and otherwise frolicking, a merry band of black Africans approached the bonfire, their arms and legs adorned with ivory bangles, pearls glistening on multicolored loincloths. In a separate group, one could notice the optimates, the leading figures of the People's Party, and the functionaries of the Communist Party. But being in the opposition is a peculiar, unnoticed, one might even say wretched state. To be near power? Now that is something else entirely. Magistrate Tullius I gave the order to set the tables and treat all the townspeople and guests. In an instant, the tables were filled with every imaginable delicacy in the world, the description of which would exhaust any fantasy. On Tullius's order, the local country folk were also invited to the tables. An unprecedented feast of eating and drinking began. The Estonians poured beer down their throats by the capful. The Russians were not stingy with the vodka. The Celtic Highlanders had set aside their refined whiskies, drinking it like men and offering it to others. The Arab nobles and the original inhabitants of Palestine, who did not consume alcohol, passed around expensive pipes and cigars with intoxicating tobacco. The black Africans naively tasted both drinks and became so drunk they were the first seen jumping over the midsummer fire, defying the high flames. For High Consul Popular, Magistrate Tullius, and Master Lepidus, 3 dining couches had been arranged by the bonfire with soft feather padding and covers of the finest purple. Propped comfortably on their left arms, the patricians, more precisely the first-generation patricians, lay on the dining couches, warming themselves by the bonfire and enjoying the best wines and delicious treats. They had changed into white dining garments, their heads adorned with wreaths of laurel and roses. The patricians began a relaxed conversation befitting the occasion.
Hoc est vivere bis, vita posse priore frui.
To know how to enjoy life is to live twice, sighed Magistrate Tullius contentedly, taking a good draught of fine Falernian wine from the silver goblet.
Primum vivere, deinde philosophari.
First live, then philosophize, said High Consul Popular, as if wishing to show his subordinate his proper place. After these words, he stuffed a large piece of smoked eel into his mouth. The eel had only that morning been swimming in the thickets on the shores of Lake Vortsjarv, then caught and brought as contraband in a marathon runner's backpack to the dining table of the Tallinn patricians.
Ante senectutem curavi, ut bene viverem, in senectute ut bene moriar.
Before old age, I take care to live well. In old age, to die well. Lepidus remained firm in his principles, for even at the feast, he did not forget the roofs of Tallinn's old town. Lepidus feared that someone might exploit the midsummer celebrations mala fide, in bad faith, and snatch the old town roofs from under him, tear them down and build the old town a few floors higher, ruining Lepidus's business plan.
Si fueris Romae, Romano vivito more.
When in Rome, do as the Romans do. High Consul Popular left himself the last word with superior authority, repeating a well-known saying, and began a new topic.
But the party gained more and more momentum. The people had taken each other's hands and, singing in a vast variety of languages and dancing African ritual dances, they frolicked around the midsummer bonfire.
At the swing hill, the bolder country boys had begun to swing the swing over the axle, which left the city slickers agape. The Arab nobles organized a camel race on the sandy seashore. Tullius and Popular, having become particularly boisterous and boastful from the delicious food and wine, decided to hold a race between their litters. Although Tullius sat in his litter with his wife, he was still faster. Yet he delicately allowed Popular to pull ahead before the finish line. The Russians in monomock caps and sable furs challenged everyone with the strength and courage to a pull-the-stick contest. In the meadow, 2 men from Harjuma had fallen into a quarrel over some girls and were giving each other a manful thumping on the jaw. The Celtic Highlanders, experts in fist-fighting, watched them cheering and cheering on, holding thumbs for first one fighter and then the other. The Optimates watched this farce from the sidelines and shook their heads enviously. O tempora, O mores, O the times, O the customs. Berenica and Emilius danced and frolicked with the others. To catch their breath, they went to the banquet tables, and Berenike popped treats into Emilius's mouth, giggling as she said, "When a man eats, a man can." Emilius drank beer while offering wine to Berenike. Soon Berenike became so boisterous that around 12:30 she called Emilius into the woods to find the fern flower, which was supposed to bring eternal happiness and love. They walked hand in hand toward the copse. Emilius's breathing became faster for some reason, and Berenike trembled slightly, though it was a warm summer night. At the edge of the woods, Berenike noticed a glowworm shining on a fern.
"I found the fern flower,"
she cried happily, and tucked the glowworm into her hair. Emilius found more and adorned Berenike's blonde hair with them. Berenike fell silent, pressing herself happily against Emilius.
Do glowworms fly too?
Berenike asked, more to break the silence and say something poetic.
No, of course not, Berenike, Emilius replied gently.
But father said they fly,
Berenike argued in a girlish way.
Well, generally they do, but very, very low, Emilius agreed, so as not to come into conflict with his future father-in-law.
Father said only the male fireflies fly, but the females emit light to lure the males.
Berenike carried on with some double-edged talk.
Emilius, let's play glowworms. I'll be the female light-emitting glowworm, and you fly around among the ferns, searching for me.
With these words, Berenike tucked more shining glowworms into her hair and vanished among the ferns. Emilius, wishing to look like a genuine female-seeking firefly, pulled off his shirt, dropped his trousers, and remained in his linen undershirt and long white underpants, waiting among the ferns, hoping to spot a glowing worm. Suddenly he saw a white glowing patch in the distance. He spread his arms, hummed like a flying firefly, and rushed through the ferns toward the glowing patch. The glowing patch among the ferns moved zigzaggedly, sometimes vanishing and then reappearing. In the white summer night, Emilius spotted Berenike running naked among the ferns, glowworms shining in her hair. At first, it took Emilius's breath away, but then he felt himself a true male firefly. An irresistible urge arose in Emilius to catch the glowworm. He ran as if mad, seeing and understanding nothing before him, with only the glowing worm in his eyes. After a short chase and zigzagging through the ferns, the firefly caught the glowworm and caught her in his embrace. Their lips melted into one burning kiss, and the glowworm and firefly sank with a quiet sigh onto the soft moss under the ferns. At this point, one could return to the midsummer bonfire and delicately leave the glowworm and firefly to themselves. But, per Iocum, for a jest, I must note the following. Although love, or rather love-making, is a serious matter, in the course of things a most ungodly thought occurred to Emilius. In certain situations, a tail would come in handy for a man, as the midges were doing terrible things to his backside. The lady's situation was somewhat better,
though the grass was slightly dewy. The white summer night had become even whiter, but the midsummer party carried on. Popular whirled in a dance with Tullius's young wife, while Tullius frolicked with two black girls in loincloths, his white dining toga fluttering. The lictors had finally separated the brawling Harjama men with a few snaps of the rods across their shins, and now they drank beer together in brotherhood, forgetting the existence of the girls who had set them to quarreling. Hanging love-struck on each other's arms, not noticing the dew-wet grass, Berenike and Emilius returned to the bonfire. A bit tired but happy, they sat by the fire. Berenike asked Emilius to wait a bit and headed alone to the sacred spring. On the way, she plucked a white daisy and tore off its petals one by one with the words, "He loves me. He loves me not. He loves me. He loves me not." The last petal fell on the word, "loves." Berenike threw a handful of coins into the spring as a gift for the beautiful water nymph and washed herself. Washing in a spring on midsummer night was supposed to make a maiden beautiful and keep her young for a long time. Coming from the spring, Berenike gathered flowers and carefully ensured there were 9 kinds, including the midsummer flower, wormwood, valerian, lily of the valley, and others, each of which had its own meaning, destined to bring luck and keep youth and fertility. Berenike wove the flowers into a wreath, placed it on her head, and appeared clean and beautiful before Emilius, who awaited her with outstretched arms. The first working day after Midsummer Day began for Berenike and Emilius as usual. Still, much had changed. Emilius had come to work before Berenike and placed a bouquet of wildflowers in a vase, while Berenike hung the dried midsummer flower wreath, the keeper of happiness, above her desk. Emilius and Berenike enjoyed their happiness and love. They found joy in the working days spent together and the evenings spent in each other's company. Often, Emilius invited Berenike to his little bachelor home on the edge of the forest near the city. Becoming increasingly attached to Emilius and considering him already her own, Berenike played the mistress of the house in Emilius's bachelor home, often staying overnight. But Berenike was troubled by the fact that Emilius had never once visited her home or met her parents. Emilius always found some excuse, promising to visit for certain, but another time. One morning upon arriving at work, Emilius waved some large sheets of paper from the doorway and proudly announced, "The project for my villa." Berenike's heart skipped a beat. She would have gladly preferred to hear, "The project for our villa." Emilius set about telling eagerly how beautiful, large, and expensive a house he planned to build for himself. At least 3 stories, with balconies, verandas, and a large bedroom, a sauna, and a whirlpool bath, with a view of the sea from the hall balcony. Berenike supported him in this magnificent venture. She praised all the architectural and interior design solutions Emilius proposed, while he changed them incessantly, and discussed again and again what and how would be grander and more original. At the same time, however, Berenike felt that Emilius did not associate this villa with her, Berenike. Almost a year had passed since the midsummer night when she had become Emilius's own, but Emilius gave no sign that he wished to take Berenike as his wife. He had never spoken on the subject, had not given even a hint. He did not even give Berenike the chance to resist a little, to ask him to wait a while longer, to be sure of each other's feelings. Emilius gave no hint that would confirm Berenike's hopes. Yet Berenike hoped, for she loved Emilius, and believed that Emilius loved her too. Every morning, when Emilius arrived at work, or when dining together during the day, visiting a nightclub in the evening, and lying in bed in each other's arms at night, Berenike awaited one sentence, whispered by Emilius. "Marry me." But no such sentence came from Emilius's lips. Berenike was also troubled by the fact that Emilius invited her home less and less often, and their joint lunches and evening nightclub visits became rarer. Berenike felt anxiety in her heart at times, then a vague sadness.
In the middle of another working day, Emilius rushed into the office with a frantic face, placed a beautiful little bouquet of flowers on the desk before Berenike, and cried out 2 auspicious words for her.
Let's go register.
Glancing at Berenike's short dress, in which she looked very simple and girlish, he said,
Stop by home and put something else on.
Let us leave Berenike to change her clothes now, and speak of what was behind Emilius's change of heart, and what he meant by the words, let's go register. Emilius had funneled hundreds of millions out of the support fund into offshore companies to then finance the construction of his villa through complex schemes. Magistrate Tullius, however, had given him a signal that the tax police were on his trail. The magistrate recommended formally legally handing over the office to someone else he trusted and who would obey him, and to manage the support fund from the shadows, so to speak. Emilius followed Magistrate Tullius's wise advice, as the magistrate was a recognized specialist in such financial schemes. He decided to register Berenike as the sole manager of the fund and remove himself from the board. Coming from the town hall, from Magistrate Tullius, he had hurried into a flower shop on Muravaha Street and pointed to one of the smaller, inexpensive bouquets. The saleswoman smiled understandingly and quickly packed the bouquet in beautiful plastic. By chance, Emilius had pointed to a bridal bouquet. Undoubtedly, Emilius had no intention of giving Berenike a bridal bouquet or inviting her to the civil registry office to register a marriage. He wanted to gladden Berenike a little with the flowers and invite her to a notary to formalize Berenike as the fund manager, or, as the common folk say, as a tankist, frontman, fall guy. Now, however, we return to Berenike. Berenike was just finishing her change of clothes. She had adorned herself in a beautiful white wedding dress that had been hanging in the closet for a long time, waiting for its time. A transparent veil covered her soulful, love-beautified face, which, it is true, was slightly flushed with excitement. But this only made her even more charming, more girlish. Bridal bouquet in hand, white veil fluttering in the wind, Berenike hurried joyfully and happily onto the street, waved down the first available litter, and ordered it to speed as fast as legs could carry to the address named by Emilius to register. Emilius was already waiting in his ordinary work suit, which caused Berenike a small disappointment, as she had thought Emilius too would have managed to dress in a festive suit. Emilius took the veil from Berenike's head, placed it beside the bridal bouquet in the litter, threw a quick glance at Berenike's white wedding dress, shrugged, and led Berenike through the door to the notary. As if in a dream, Berenike listened to the notary's explanations, signed some documents, and followed Emilius out of the notary's office. Outside, Emilius grabbed his mobile phone, dialed a number, and announced happily,
The tankist is in place.
Emilius reported the situation regarding the management of the support fund to Magistrate Tullius, and then turned to Berenike.
Berenike, I'll tell you more later. Take the afternoon off, and don't burden yourself with any more work today. You are the sole manager of the support fund now, after all.
Having said these reassuring words, Emilius hopped into his BMW litter and sped away, leaving Berenike standing stunned in the street in her white wedding dress, holding the veil and the bridal bouquet. What happened in Berenike's soul? It is wiser to refrain from describing it in words, for it is hard to describe love in words, and even harder, it's shattering. After the visit to the notary, the working days passed as before. Berenike was the secretary, and Emilius was effectively the manager of the fund, though he was seen working in his office less and less frequently, until finally he did not appear there at all, tending to some affairs of his own. Berenike, however, as the manager of the fund, answered some letters and telephone calls as best she could. Occasionally, Emilius invited Berenike to lunch and chatted with her about trifles, without opening himself up to her. Sometimes he invited her for a walk, questioning Berenike about the fund's affairs. During another such walk, Emilius and Berenike passed the market located behind the Baltic station. Emilius stopped.
Berenike, let's go to the market. They sell all sorts of junk here. Maybe we'll find something interesting. They walked between the market stalls. All sorts of clutter was on sale. Old clothes, packaged foodstuffs, new and old books. All sorts of people were moving about. They seemed to be looking for something or waiting for someone. Few were making purchases. Emilius, too, failed to make a purchase. He found nothing interesting. Leaving the market, Emilius suggested to Berenike that they step into one of the eating places that surrounded the market and offered their services. They opened the door of the first place they came across and stepped inside. Not a soul was to be seen inside, except for a dull-faced server. Berenike sat at a table and asked for only a glass of juice. Emilius went to the counter and ordered 2 orange juices and something to eat. "We only have beef stroganoff," the server replied indifferently. She then searched for a long time for suitable glasses in which to pour the orange juice, and failing to find them, poured the juice into glasses of various sizes and purposes. After a short wait, beef stroganoff with boiled potatoes and a cup with 2 pieces of bread were placed before Emilius. Emilius began to eat, but at the same time his appetite vanished. The food smelled unpleasant and was tasteless. Not even a bit of green had been added for visual appeal. Emilius picked at one edge of the plate and then the other, then angrily tossed his knife and fork onto the plate and took the unfinished food to the table for unwashed dishes. It occurred to Emilius that this eating place had likely not been established for the service of guests, but for the purpose of money laundering. Through it, the movement of cash could be shown. Emilius and Berenike sat in silence, occasionally lifting their juice glasses to their lips. Emilius was occupied with his business thoughts. Berenike's eyes, however, had settled on a young man. Having just stepped through the door, a young man of nearly 30 with a peculiar facial expression caught sight of the table of dirty dishes, clapped his hands with great joy, and spoke something to the server, pointing with his hand toward Emilius's half-eaten food. The server nodded in agreement. The young man grabbed Emilius's dish, sat at a table, rubbed his hands with delight before picking up the knife and fork, and set about eating hungrily. Having emptied the plate quickly, he took it back to the dirty dishes table, thanked the server, and left with the happy expression of a well-fed person. Berenike felt a sudden sense of guilt toward the young man. She also felt shame, not for the young man, but for herself. From the young man's expression and behavior, it appeared he was not of entirely sound mind, yet not completely foolish, if one may say so of a person. He was law-abiding. He asked permission to eat the food scraps. He was not emotionally labile. He rejoiced at the sight of the half-eaten food, clapped his hands, and expressed delight before starting to eat. He was also orderly and polite. He cleared the dishes after himself and thanked heartily for the food. Of course, if society has reached a level in its development where law-abidingness, orderliness, and politeness are considered foolishness, then this young man was undoubtedly a fool.
Can we be happy when there are so many unhappy people around? Berenike asked herself. All people born into the world have a right to life and, consequently, to food. Can we consider ourselves civilized while ignoring the needs of other people? Berenike mused to herself. It seemed to Emilius that Berenike had become sad and silent for some reason, and he regretted bringing her to this unfriendly eating place. He had not noticed that for some people it was a very friendly eating place indeed. Emilius's villa, his domus, was completed in less than half a year. According to experts, its cost could have reached nearly 100 million kroons. Emilius had sunk into it all the money he had funneled out of the support fund through offshore companies. The house had been built, to put it crudely, under the obvious influence of megalomania. Such a house can only be built by a person who has not earned money through adequate work and therefore does not know how to spend it reasonably. The country folk called it by a fitting name, the House of Fools. The house was adorned with a vast number of domes, towers, and balconies. Watchtowers stood at the corners of the house, where armed guards dozed day and night. Before the main door stood a slave with a club to ward off uninvited guests,
and husbands who took it into their heads to search here for their philandering wives. From the hallway, the vestibulum, the floor of which was adorned with mosaic tiles with the words "Cave Canem, beware of the dog," a wide staircase decorated with carvings and various figures led to the second floor, the atrium. From this giant hall with a balcony, through barred windows and over a high fence, a beautiful view of the sea and the old town of Tallinn opened up. From the atrium, doors led to the triclinium, the dining room, and the bedroom. In the spacious bedroom, with barred windows, stood a bed of giant proportions decorated with a purple canopy, a mountain of feather pillows enticingly in the middle of the bed. A beautiful rose bed could be seen through the bars. In the wide corridors was placed a vast amount of art of questionable value, which seemed to emphasize the master's wealth, sense of beauty, and artistic taste. From the corridor, a wide double door with colored glass led to the peristyle, a rectangular courtyard with 8 columns. A 3-meter-high green-painted board fence was fixed to the columns.
For heating the house, a hypocaust was used, central heating in the common tongue. Warm air was directed into heating channels located under the floor. In the garrets, the slaves' quarters, charcoal pans were used for heating. For the guests, a rich table was set in the triclinium. It was hard to give a name to all the delicacies or to guess what they were made of, yet all were extremely tasty. Everyone could choose drinks according to their desire, ranging from wines to the most expensive whiskeys. Those present gorged themselves to the limit. By this, they expressed respect for the host. Some particularly fawning guests stuffed themselves with food until they vomited, expressing ultimate respect for the master of the house. For vomiting, a separate corner of the triclinium had been designed by the architect, a vomitorium. Berenika had also been invited. She walked through the rooms, looking at the art objects and the paintings on the walls. The large bedroom with the canopy bed left her completely cold. She walked as if in a museum, associating nothing around her with herself, Emilius, or their past love. Emptiness reigned in her heart. She knew that never again would she be the same trusting and sincere Berenike. Emilius's rose-tinted villa did not stir envy in her. There are things that cannot be replaced or bought for money. Only about a week remained until this summer's midsummer day. Berenike was overcome by sadness and anxiety. She did not know how to spend midsummer day, whether Emilius would invite her to the bonfire as he had a year ago. Fate decided for Berenike once again. The police stepped into her office, conducted a search, placed her hands in irons, and took her to a detention cell. Berenike spent midsummer day there, after which she was released pending the investigation, having signed a statement not to leave her place of residence. Upon the conclusion of the investigation, the file was handed over to the court, and the court passed sentence: 3 years deprivation of liberty in a closed prison for the embezzlement of the fund's money in an exceptionally large amount. At this point, it should be noted in Berenike's justification that she had not stolen a single coin of the fund's money. She had only written her signatures on the papers that dear Emilius, whom she still loved, had placed before her. Berenike sat at home and waited for them to come to take her to prison to serve her sentence. Another of Emilius's working days, the planning and calculation of financial schemes, had ended. Satisfied with his day's work, he sat in his BMW litter and headed home, to the barred villa on the seashore, grabbing some bundles of beer from a roadside supermarket on the way. Before the gate, he pressed the electronic key hanging on his keychain, but the gate did not open. He pressed it several more times, but the gate remained closed. Electronics obviously busted, Emilius thought to himself, cursing. I'll call the firm's rep tomorrow. He climbed out of the litter, searched his pocket for the gate key, and shoved it into the keyhole. At the same moment, he felt a heavy hand on his shoulder.
"What are you poking at here, you blockhead?"
A gruff question was put to him.
I've come to my home. The electronics aren't working, Emilius replied with a frightened voice, for he did not belong to the particularly brave class of men, and such a situation was unexpected for him.
"What bloody home?" roared another giant of a man who had stepped up. "This has been our boss's house for nearly half a year already. Get the hell out!" And Emilius received a kick to the backside, while the first of the men kicked the door panel of Emilius's litter for his own amusement. At this point, seeking a quick resolution of the situation, the following legally based circumstances must be explained, with some small exceptions. Certain individuals had kept an eye on Emilius's villa since its foundation stone. Scarcely had the last guests present at the villa's housewarming party left when a single message was sent by mobile phone. "Let her rip." The said message meant that a person possessing Emilius's false passport as the seller and a certain vagrant possessing a genuine passport as the buyer were to step through the notary's door and proceed to formalize the sale of Emilius's real estate along with its essential parts, that is, the villa. The notary, having checked the identity and legal capacity of the buyer and seller, found that the transaction could proceed. The transaction was formalized, and the fresh, vagrant owner of the villa was put on a diet. 250 grams of vodka a day, and that was it. His keep and a free mattress. 3 months later, the vagrant had been entered into the land registry as the owner of the property along with everything on it, that is, the villa. After that, a new trip to the notary was made. The vagrant villa owner formalized a testament in the name of certain individuals for a payment of 500 kroons. Receiving such an unprecedentedly large sum of money, the vagrant went on a binge and drank himself to death. The inheritance was declared open, and the testament was executed. Certain individuals received the inheritance and sold the property along with the villa several more times, until the aforementioned boss of the security guards became the final good faith owner. Simple and legal, with small exceptions. Emilius was now without a villa and without money. Undoubtedly, it could be argued that he still had his BMW litter. He did, but the thugs wanted to drive the litter. They hijacked it and, while drunk, smashed it into a heap. They themselves barely escaped with their lives, but of the BMW litter, only, as the common folk say, the number and a bucket remained. Since Emilius's song was sung, as many are accustomed to say with schadenfreude, we return to Berenike. Berenike had already begun to hope that the court sentence for her imprisonment might not be executed after all. It could also happen that she had been forgotten or overlooked by the enforcement officials. She had read in some newspaper that such a miraculous thing had happened. But Berenike's hope was in vain. In the early morning of a beautiful autumn day, there was a knock on her door. A policeman stepped in. Deus ex machina, God from the machine, greeted her politely and ordered Berenike to get ready to go to prison, while he himself sat on a stool near the door without asking permission, as if guarding the exit. "Bring 2 sets of underwear, socks, a toothbrush and paste, a piece of soap, a towel. You have 20 minutes. The policeman read out the automatically memorized text. But then he remembered that at home his wife was constantly fiddling with his electric shaver and filling it with some indeterminate hairs, and he clarified, "No safety razors or straight razors allowed." Berenike began to bustle about feverishly and in a panic, not knowing where to begin. She ran from one room to another, pulled open clothing drawers, not even knowing what she was looking for. The policeman on the stool chuckled and gave her the right guidance. "If you wish, you can take a shower." This was a sound recommendation. Preparations for setting off always begin there. Berenike followed the advice, washed herself first with warm water, then with bracing cold water, and felt her self-control gradually returning. She dried herself, now calmed, wrapped herself in a terry-cloth towel, and stepped to the linen cupboard. For a long time she chose her underwear, but she could not decide which would be most suitable for going to prison. She pushed the sexy lingerie aside with an ironic smirk. Finally, she chose underwear suitable for going to work. For a while, she debated how to dress. A party dress certainly wouldn't do, yet dressing in very strict, dark clothes was also unpleasant to her. The choice settled on a grey suit.
She chose shoes with a not too high heel, yet not too low either. Next, Berenike fussed with her makeup. She considered makeup that was too prominent to be unsuitable in this situation, yet she did not want to leave the house without making herself feminine. Finally, her eyes and eyebrows took on modest tones, while her lips took on a darker coloring. Bright red lips would have suggested a captured harlot, but Berenike wanted to appear simply as a modest woman, albeit an imprisoned one. Having dealt with herself, a problem arose with the travel bag. Berenike could not find a travel bag suitable for going to prison. And are there even firms in the world that produce travel bags for ladies going to prison? Finally, she decided in favor of a plastic bag, especially since she was allowed to bring very little gear. Finished, she looked around the room once more, as if saying farewell, and stepped into the hallway. The policeman raised his eyebrows in surprise for a moment and was taken aback, seeing a beautiful, tastefully dressed lady before him. The pensioner crones leaning out of the window saw a policeman in the prime of his manhood emerging from the stairwell with a young, good-looking woman. Before their eyes rose a scene from a film seen on television, where a powerful policeman of interest to women and a pretty, sexy prosecutor have successfully concluded another police operation and are returning to the station, arranging an evening meeting on the way. The policeman opened the door of an unmarked car. The lady sat in the car, thanking him as she did so, and the car pulled away. This time, however, reality differed significantly from what is shown in films. The car gathered speed and headed toward the Suurpatare prison. Ships standing in the harbor, Fat Margaret, and the residential district of the Nouveau Riche passed before Berenike's eyes. The inhabitants of the said residential district had spent shorter or longer terms in the Suurpatare prison and felt at home, for from there, just as from the Suurpatare prison, a view of the prison and the sea opened up. Berenike's eyes glided over the roadside trees and bushes illuminated by the morning sun, as if she were saying farewell to freedom and all of living nature. The maple leaves, already turned yellow, created in her such a deep sense of sadness that her heart began to ache. The policeman rang the bell at the prison door. For a while, scuffling and the clinking of keys were heard. Then the prison guard's nose appeared at a tiny hatch. The policeman thrust his work ID under the nose. The nose sniffed it searchingly. Then one door lock creaked, then a second, and even a third. Finally, the door opened. The policeman politely allowed the lady to step inside before him and followed her, while the prison guard had already set about fumbling with the lock of the next door. More precisely, a barred door. A certain peculiar, specific smell stifled Berenike's soul. She could not associate it with anything. In fact, it was the most ordinary smell of the Suurpatare prison, a mixture of the stench of cabbage soup and the slop buckets of the prison cells. Going up the stairs, the policeman strode ahead, and Berenike followed him. A moment later, the escort knocked on the prison governor's door and stepped in without waiting for an answer, handed over some papers, received a signature, and left, nodding to Berenike. The prison governor was a gentleman past middle age, an officer in a grand uniform. He stood up upon receiving the guest, shook Berenike by the hand, and asked her to sit in the armchair beside his desk. The impression was as if a correspondent for a women's magazine had come to interview the prison governor. The prison governor was not that naive, however. He knew exactly the contingent of arrivals and departures for the day. Likewise, the guards and the corresponding surveillance system reported every movement from the prison gate to his office. But today the prison governor felt like a true gentleman. In the form of the beautiful prisoner, he was not dealing with the daily harlots. His guest was a woman after all, despite the fact that in this case it was a prisoner. Wishing to begin the conversation with a suitable joke, and perhaps also checking the lady's knowledge, the prison governor asked good-humoredly,
"Do you know where the place in prison is where coffee is served to ladies?"
and answered himself, "The prison governor's office." Then he burst into merry laughter over his successful joke. The prison governor poured coffee for Berenike,
placed the sugar bowl beside it, and began a conversation with the lady. My subordinates will introduce you to our living conditions and regulations. You always have the right to address me orally or in writing. There is nothing to be ashamed of. Life wants to be lived even in prison, and as well as possible at that. The prison governor paused. Berenike nodded understandingly and, fearing to offend the boss, took a sip of the coffee. It was as good as in the finest cafes. It seemed the prison governor was a master of coffee brewing. The prison governor continued. I won't waste your time needlessly. Get yourself settled. He paused for a moment and continued. In prison, the best thing to keep your thoughts away is to read a book. In our library, you can find Dostoevsky, Anna Karenina. We have many books.
I'd rather not read Dostoevsky and Anna Karenina right now, Berenike spoke up, continuing the literary conversation.
You may be right. In this place, that literature is a bit heavy, the prison governor agreed. But while staying here, the most suitable things to read are, for example, Indian stories, travelogues. There are many descriptions of nature, active deeds, brave and enterprising male heroes.
I'll read the travel descriptions, Berenike agreed with the prison governor.
The prison governor picked up the telephone, pressed some numbers, likely dialing the library, and gave the order to bring a travelogue. With that, he read a long string of numbers into the receiver, the prisoner's code number, which contained all the data, the prisoner's age, sex, the article of the criminal code, the term set for the sentence, and some other meanings known only to specialists. While waiting for the librarian, the prison governor exchanged a few more words with Berenike, mostly polite trifles in such a situation. He also touched upon the weather, regretting that the past midsummer day had been too rainy. The librarian, a sturdy youngish giant of a man with a shaven head and tattooed wrists, stepped in and placed a book before Berenike, casting an appraising and brazen glance over her as he did so. A stern wave of the prison governor's hand forced the librarian to leave faster than he would have liked. Berenike read the title of the book, Robinson Crusoe.
Better a sailor than a failed businessman, she thought to herself, and placed the book in her plastic bag.
A good book. It tells of warm lands and seas. In our climate, where it is constantly slushy and cold, this book is very good to read. The prison governor praised the item and stood up, indicating that the reception was over. I won't say goodbye with a handshake. We live in the same house now, after all, he said with a smile and pressed a buzzer. A female prison guard stepped in. She was somehow gloomy and sullen, as if her husband had paid her too little attention the previous night, or had ignored her altogether. Berenike was taken to a prison cell. Next, I shall explain to the reader some important internal regulations of the prison. From the Sur Patere prison, prisoners were allowed out for 1 evening a week until 12 o'clock at night, on the condition that upon stepping into free society, they had at least 100 kroons in their pocket. Such foresight prevented those leaving the prison from committing thefts in the free world. Berenike too used such an opportunity for walking in the city. Occasionally, she stepped into the first Old Town cafe she came across and sat there sadly, drinking her coffee and watching with a little envy the carefree, happy young men and maidens sitting in the cafe. Emilius had found out that Berenike could be met at the prison gate, and every evening from 6 o'clock onwards, he waited for Berenike at the prison gate, a wilted lilac flower in his hand. He had plucked it well in advance, at midday. Emilius also had 100 kroons in his pocket for Berenike. But Emilius did not know that, besides sullen prison guards, there are also good and kind ones in the world. A kind-hearted and helpful prison guard had shown Berenike another exit from the prison, so that she would not have to encounter Emilius, as Berenike no longer wished to see him. Emilius, however, continued his waiting at the prison gate. The townspeople could see a businessman of the sorrowful countenance crossing the town hall square every day at the same time. Since he walked as if in a dream, his path was relatively complex, though there was a shorter way to the prison. Having crossed the town hall square and passed through Aptekri Street, Emilius turned left onto Vene Street. He strode, introverted and noticing nothing around him, the wilted lilac flower between his fingers. By the Dominican monastery, he turned left again and toiled up Puhavaimu Street. Reaching the top of the hill, he threw a quick glance at the clock of the Holy Spirit Church, turned right, and continued his journey with a hunched back and occasionally stumbling along Pick Street. Emilius passed the House of the Blackheads and the Green Market. By the police house, he seemed to startle for a moment and turned sharply around the corner into Pagari Street. Having successfully reached a distance from the police house, he walked along Lai Street, past St. Olaf's Church, and after some zigzagging through short side streets, emerged at Fat Margaret. He passed through the great coastal gate, crossed the tram tracks and Pohja Avenue, and walked straight ahead along Surpatarai Street. He was reaching the destination of his journey, the gate of the Surpatarai prison.
Emilius took up his sentry post at the prison gate and waited for Berenike. While Emilius waits there for Berenike in vain, let us use our time more purposefully and continue on the theme of prison life. To ensure that the prison walls did not create a sense of oppression in the prisoner, the prisoners were allowed to watch video films, the scenes of which were filmed according to a script written by themselves. For example, a prisoner in the prison missed his villa on the Viimsi Peninsula. He missed the park surrounding his villa, nearly 10,000 square meters in size, the park paths and the merry little dog running about on them, the little artificial lake with white swans swimming on it, and the black swan that offered them company. He longed to see the squirrel jumping in the park trees and to feel in his nostrils the enticing smell of a piece of meat roasting over a bonfire, basted with white wine. All this was now made possible to see and perceive with all the senses by the script written by the prisoner himself in the form of a first-person hero, and the video film made according to it. Watching his own video film, the prisoner again felt himself walking on his home villa's park paths, the little dog jumping before him when it wasn't busy barking at the squirrel. The white swans flapped their wings. Occasionally, the cawing of a crow was heard. The smell of roasting meat pleasantly tickled his nostrils, pushing aside the sensations arising from the prison macaroni. The prisoner's sense of oppression vanished completely. The video film strengthened their psychological health in itself. Thus, the production and showing of such video films was a psychologically correct approach to the matter. But in everything there are exceptions, or rather, nulla regula sine exceptione. No rule is without exception. There were, unfortunately, such prisoners whose life course and milieu consisted primarily of thefts, robberies, rapes, and murders. Undoubtedly, no normal person will write a script about themselves, and in the first person at that, containing the aforementioned misdeeds. After all, normal people end up in prison. The psychologically ill are not convicted. Proceeding from the above, or considering the above, as they say in court judgments, the prisoners who had committed the aforementioned misdeeds, embezzlers of state property on a large scale, robbers, murderers, rapists, set about writing film scripts about themselves that tended to turn into heroic epics or odes. There was also love poetry. The problem arose, however, because when watching the video film composed about themselves according to such scripts, the miscreants tended to laugh themselves to death. There was even one fatality. The state's duty is to protect the life and health of its citizens, for lex recte facere jubet, vetat delinquere. The law commands one to act rightly. A solution was found. The state budget began to finance salaried scriptwriters. Their task was to write an autobiographical script that was humanly acceptable for rapists, robbers, thieves, and murderers, while avoiding odiousness, pomposity, and overdone love poetry. The scriptwriters set to work. But since work paid with state money is expensive, the state scriptwriters wrote, for example, nearly 100 episodes of a humane video film about one state thief, just to rake in more dough. The state might have endured these expenses, but still, the script scenes tended to contain obvious exaggerations. Some murderer looked like a guardian angel, according to it, a rapist like a modestly blushing first lover, and the embezzler of state property had acquired the halo of a saint. To avoid such exaggerations at state expense, censorship was introduced. The governor of the Suo Patere prison was appointed censor. Every morning at 9:05, the censor placed a cup of black coffee before him, like a real writer, rubbed his hands with delight, and set about reading scripts. The most pleasant working hours of the day lay ahead. The censor read the scripts with interest, sometimes laughing boisterously, which created a fear in the prison guards listening with their ears against the door that he might burst from laughter. Then again, the censor would strike the table with his fist as if arguing against something. Occasionally, he would pause for a moment and stare dreamily lovedly at the ceiling. From time to time, he made notes on the right margin of the script manuscript. For example, on the autobiographical script of a serial killer, which contained only episodes of charity, the censor made a note: insert one routine everyday whacking here. On the script of a rapist, in which the main hero appeared as an extremely modest and helpless first lover, the censor wrote in bold letters across the text, "I allow the first lover to carry the matter to its conclusion, but only very, very gently." The autobiographical script of a saintly embezzler of state property on a large scale, in which not a word was mentioned of thefts, sparked indignation in the censor and forced him to strike the table with his fist. The script received the instruction, add a couple of small pickpocketings. Berenika declined to write a film script for herself, for it would have been too sad, and she did not trust her love to the hands of professional scriptwriters. Julius's head began to show signs of clarity once more. He was already able to distinguish the letters in the book and read. Therefore, let us try not to disturb him, and say farewell to Berenike and Emilius, though not adieu, for we hope that we shall meet again. Ecce homo, behold the man. Julius continued reading. Clear signs of decline began to manifest in Roman life. Crime took hold. Even before sunset, while the red solar disk still illuminated the Roman hills, the citizens set about fortifying themselves against gangs of thieves and robbers. Gates were bolted. Those citizens who lacked the wealth to fit iron bars over their windows pushed shut massive wooden shutters and secured them with latches. The citizens hurried to reach home before dark. The streets became deserted. Only prostitutes offered their meager wares, which they carried with them constantly, regardless of night or day. One could still encounter drunkards, despisers of life, brawling in the street after being tossed out of some cheap dive, unable to find the way home, if they had a home at all. Emperor Nero, who had become entirely unhinged, went roaming the streets of Rome in disguise, picking fights and letting his attendants beat the drunkards and prostitutes. For his own amusement, he pried open the barred windows of wealthy citizens and the shutters of the poor. The emperor plundered shops and organized auctions of stolen goods, dragging citizens out of their homes at night to participate in the bidding. After the auction, he stripped himself naked and bathed in the fountain of the Campus Martius. Whether it was the warm water of the Campus Martius fountain or the dichlorvos-laced beer, Julius's head spun once more. He tried to read, but unable to distinguish the lines of text, he turned his gaze toward the forum in front of the town hall to give his eyes a rest. Across the town hall square, heading toward King Street, went a gang of barbarians, laughing loudly and arrogantly jostling those coming toward them. Their bodies were covered in tunics of identical cut, with 3 wide white stripes on the sides and a fake Adidas emblem on the buttocks. They wore brown leather jackets and counterfeit sneakers. The town hall lictors watched them in terror, hiding behind the massive columns of the hall. The barbarian gang passed through King Street, moved along Nun Street, smashed a few concrete trash cans along the way, and vanished behind the Baltic station. Staggering out of Vanaturu Street came Popilius, an advisor to the foreign consul with a litter on his back. He had quarreled with his bearers while drunk, chased them away, and was now carrying the litter himself. It should be mentioned in advance that the foreign consul was not bothered by advisor Popilius's drunken stumbling. A free citizen in a free country decides for himself whether he sits inside the litter or carries it on his back. Advisor Popilius staggered with his burden into Vurime Street, swayed a bit on Peak Street, and then took the correct heading to reach the top of Pikjolg. There he got stuck for a moment with his litter between the city gates, bumped it against the gateposts, dropped the litter with a clatter, and sat against the gates to rest his legs. Scarcely had Popilius closed his eyes to doze for a bit when some thugs jumped him. They kicked the legs off the litter, fumbled through Popilius's pockets, snatched the hat from his head, and vanished as inconspicuously as they had appeared. The cool evening breeze refreshed Popilius's head slightly. He hoisted himself up, shoved the litter, which had become somewhat lighter, onto his back, and began the grueling ascent to Toompea.
Screaming and shouting, a group of plebeians rushed from Mundi Street onto the Forum, carrying blankets and pillows, pushing Metius, the consul of economics, before them. The greedy consul Metius had sold off the dormitories that had served as the plebeians' dwellings, and now the plebeians were knocking on the town hall door, demanding shelter. The lictors guarding the town hall pounced on Metius, dragged him to the wall, and shackled him to the town hall stones in iron neck collars. The plebeians poked Metius with their feet and spat on his bald head. The women lifted their tunics and showed him their backsides.
Eyes bulging and glazed, hands outstretched, a drug addict passed Julius's bench. He paused his glassy gaze for a moment on the sleeping vagrant's plastic bag, but apparently finding nothing to be had, headed toward a group of foreign tourists standing at the end of Dunkery Street. Behind him, like a shadow, lurked a prostitute. Hard to say what interest a drug addict might hold for a prostitute, or vice versa. This relatively monotonous picture was made more colorful by a magnificent litter, which, floating gently on the shoulders of 6 bearers, entered the town hall square from Prison's Neck and paused for a moment, as if paying homage to the councillors. One of the lictors, guarding the main door, rushed to the litter and tucked something under his coat, given by the hairy hand of the one sitting inside. The litter turned slowly around and headed toward the old town hall pharmacy, past it, vanished into the narrow Aptegi Street, and emerged onto Veen Street. Metrobius, a boss of the People's Party, whose litter was loaded with bootleg vodka he had distilled himself, was heading to the port of Tallinn to begin his evening moonshine trade with the Finno-Ugrians of the north. This quiet scene, already drawing into evening, was interrupted by the sudden cheering and shouts of praise from a crowd. The advocate, Lentulus, arrived from a court case. Grateful defendants, their relatives and friends escorted the advocate home. The acquitted defendants, celebrating their escape, had shaved their heads bare, while their female companions, as a sign of gratitude, had unloosed their hair and bared their breasts for the advocate. Many carried laurel wreaths to nail them to the advocate's house to mark the triumph. For a while nothing happened on the town hall square. The lictors guarding the town hall had rested their rears on the steps, placed their bundles of rods aside, and were chatting among themselves, occasionally handing each other a bottle of the nectar received from Metrobius. Then, however, their attention was caught by a strange man in the middle of the square. This man did not walk, did not run, did not jump, and did not stand still. To the lictors, it seemed he was a mime. The mime suddenly leaned forward, and some invisible force, presumably gravity, pulled him more and more into a slouch. It seemed that in another moment he would crash head first onto the cobblestones. But the mime began to scuttle his legs quickly, moved a few meters forward with his head outstretched, and regained his balance. He straightened up, but apparently too far, for immediately his body began to pull backward into a curve, lower and lower. It seemed his spine would snap in another moment. But the mime repeated the same maneuver, only in reverse.
He began to scuttle backward quickly and regained his balance once more. For a while he swayed almost at the same spot, just tamping his feet slightly. Then, however, he was abruptly pulled to the right. He bent lower, and it seemed now he would certainly crash sideways onto the pavement, for he could hardly scuttle sideways. But the mime found a way out. He hopped on his right leg in the direction of the bend and managed to balance himself again, but only for a moment. Immediately he was pulled to the left. He made desperate efforts, flailed his arms, his face contorting wildly, but apparently hopping to the left while bent on one leg still required practice for the mime. His left leg got caught behind his right, and the mime crashed face down onto the town hall cobblestones. The thud of the fall echoed hollowly under the town hall vaults. The lictors, who had watched the mime while laughing and holding their bellies, were disappointed. It was still half an hour until the changing of the guard, and they had hoped to pass it merrily. But now, there you go. Some mime. One of the lictors ran to the mime and dragged him to a nearby archway to sleep off his drunken state. Silence and peace reigned over the front of the town hall again, if one did not count a few servant girls in white aprons and headscarves who, holding food baskets under their arms, hurried across the square toward home, returning from their evening shopping. Suddenly, the rattle of wagon wheels on the cobblestones and the gee-up of horses began to sound from Vanaturu Street. A row of manure wagons approached the town hall market in an endless convoy. Piled high on the wagons were Soviet-era rubles, collected from the people by the decree of the High Consul. The wagons were positioned in a tight circle around the well in the middle of the market square. The horses were unhitched, clumps of hay were tossed before them, and they were watered with water drawn from the well. The businessmen Castor and Pollux prepared for the morning ruble sale auction. Pollux stripped off his clothes, shivered in the evening chill, and climbed into the town hall square well to refresh himself a bit. The expansion of Mammon. The sun dipped toward evening. Long shadows appeared on the town hall square. Only the ancient towers of Tallinn glinted in the setting sun. The evening chill fell upon the city from the sea, making Julius shiver slightly. The vagrant slept blissfully on. For quite some time, a lone policeman had been circling the two aforementioned honorable citizens like a cat around hot porridge. To draw attention to himself, he slapped his whip against his palm. But the citizens' positions remained unchanged, as if they were statues upon which the policeman's whip exerted no encouraging influence. The policeman was confused. As an educated man, he was loath to use the whip against a citizen sitting on a bench with a book in his hand. At the same time, such a person aroused suspicion. It might even be a clandestine plot, perhaps a terrorist attack on the town hall for which the agreed-upon body position was the signal. Alas, he could not decide. The vagrant the policeman could categorize among the contingent already very familiar to him, though even of that he could not be entirely certain. Perhaps beside the book-holding citizen slept some well-known writer who had been denied support from the cultural endowment, fallen into misery and taken to drink. Such a person could be unpredictable. Once sober, he might forge some pasquinade about you, and then just try to wash yourself clean before the police high commissioner. But a policeman is paid to decide and act, for dum deliberamos, quando incipiendum incipere, iam serum fit. While we deliberate when to begin, it may already be too late. Finally, the policeman stepped forward confidently and nudged the vagrant between the shoulder blades with the tip of his whip, poking occasionally at the rear area as well. At first, the vagrant merely shrugged his shoulders as if pestered by gadflies and scratched his back in a drunken haze. Suddenly, the spark of life returned to him. The vagrant grabbed the plastic bag from between his legs, belched once, and, without noticing the policeman, headed for the shadow of the nearest houses. His jerky, angular gait gave the impression of a clockwork robot. Polyneuropathia alcoholica, the socks and gloves syndrome, Julius noted to himself.
At the first house, the vagrant turned left and vanished among the buildings of Sayakang. The policeman was satisfied with his day's work and withdrew. The chill helped clear Julius's head. Noticing the lengthened shadows on the town hall square, he decided to finish his reading and head home. He closed the book with a sense of regret, rose from the bench and strode across the square, passed through Vanaturu Street and continued along Viru Street toward the Viru gates. The town hall clock signaled to the citizens with its metallic strikes that it was time to sit at the evening tea table with the family. Let the young men seek out their prophylactics and the girls their sexy lingerie. Old Thomas twirled his mustache to a sharper point, as if he were expecting a visit from Fat Margaret. Julius passed through the Viru gate, passing a glass bar building that resembled an inflated condom. Inside the condom sat men and women, all mixed together.
A very witty and profound architectural solution, Julius praised the architect.
Julius paused at a bus stop located by the corner of a high-pillared palace. In the said palace, Slavic Orthodox practitioners conducted their secular affairs. In front of the building sat two cannons from the era of the Northern War, their barrels aimed at the port of Tallinn. Since the benches at the bus stop had just been freshly smashed, Julius leaned against a concrete trash can that had been turned on its side and waited patiently for the arrival of the number 8 bus, eyeing the surroundings to pass the time. At the bus stop stood an old crone in a coat too warm for the season. Before her feet was piled some gear, pots and pans tied together with string, a wooden clothes rack with broken pegs, a bundle of clothes tied together, a bulging plastic bag. At the end of a string, a tiny scrap of a dog. The crone stood with a worried face, and the dog, too, mimicking its mistress, had conjured a worried expression onto its face, though it could hardly have understood the gravity of the situation. The crone was, in fact, a pensioner in rent arrears who had just been evicted onto the street and was now on her way, seeking a new place to live. The crone had gone to the government official's reception to lament her trouble. He had listened with sympathy and concern, musing to himself,
Yes, a pity indeed. Well, life is just so arranged that the other half is taken away without asking permission or coordination. Of course, as a pair of pensioners, it would be easier to pay the rent, but, alas, it is always so that one goes to the other world earlier, the other later. Well now, you live together with the dog, but no pension is provided for a dog. The law does not allow it. If the dog had a pension too, one could save, pinch here and there, and the two of you could somehow get by.
The Lasname bus pulled up. The scrap of a dog jumped onto the bus, and the pensioner followed with her clinking and clattering. From the harbor appeared a giant forest of masts, sails reefed and secured to the yards. From the sea, however, approached a countless number of ships. Their number could not be determined. More and more rose from behind the horizon. They were of every kind, large and small, frigates sailing under canvas and galleys moving by means of oars. Fast canoes could also be seen, in which sat red-skinned Indians with magnificent colored feather tufts, whooping piercingly, tomahawks waving threateningly over their heads. Quietly and with serious faces, Eskimos paddled in their sealskin boats. All of them approached the port of Tallinn at a high pace, as if in a race. A frantic bustling took place at the harbor. The redskins unloaded squirrel and rabbit skins from their canoes. The Eskimos had piled seal skins in a heap on the quay, with pots of seal blubber on top. The northern Finno-Ugric tribes carried reindeer antlers from the ships. Arab nobles rolled oil barrels onto the quay. Black Africans had lined up columns of slaves for offering. From the European frigates were unloaded all sorts of trinkets, chewing gum, Pampers, and heaps of toilet paper. It seemed as if the honorable citizens of Tallinn had all suddenly been seized by the runs, and Europe's selfless aid arrived just at the last moment. The sons of Israel piled up immense wallets on the quay. The expansion of Mammon into Tallinn had begun.
Julius's attention was caught by the sound of a child's shriek and foreign chatter nearby. He turned his gaze toward the sound and noticed unusual activity at the Northern War-era cannon. An old man with long gray hair and a gray beard was loading the cannon. The cannon man wore a gray jacket and green breeches, the ends of which were tucked into jackboots. His chest was entirely covered with medals and orders. Had Julius stepped closer, he could have read the inscriptions. For the conquest of Byzantium, victory at Yuriev, hero of the Northern War, hero of the battle on the ice, defender of Sevastopol, etc., etc. The cannon man's activity was constantly interrupted by a little girl in a pink dress. Her attire did not suit the cool evening. Caring parents, in their lack of time, had given the little girl into the grandfather's care, but forgotten to add something warmer to the girl's wardrobe. This did not bother the girl, but the grandfather was too occupied with his cannon. The girl interrupted him constantly, asked all sorts of clever questions, and demanded answers. Finally, the grandfather had enough of these inquiries. He grabbed the girl in his arms and sat her astride the cannon barrel, thrusting an ice cream cone into her hand. The girl now sat contentedly swinging her legs on the cannon barrel and licking the ice cream. The cannon man poured gunpowder into the cannon barrel, took a handful of all sorts of rubbish from a nearby trash can, tin cans and empty bottles, and stuffed those into the barrel too. He then pulled a jackboot off his foot, unwound the foot wrap, shoved his bare foot back into the boot, and stuffed the foot wrap into the cannon barrel as a wad. He poured another handful of gunpowder on top. The cannon was loaded. A patriotically minded, stateless resident of the city of Tallinn was ready to defend Tallinn against the onslaught of Mammon. The cannoneer struck a match, lit a torch, and directed it squinting toward the end of the cannon barrel, ready to give fire, forgetting, meanwhile, to lift the girl from the barrel. But the little girl, either mimicking her grandfather or deciding to play a prank on him, thrust her ice cream cone into the cannon barrel with a quick motion. The grandfather's hand stopped. For a moment, he stood helpless, then indignantly tossed the torch into the trash can and expressed clear resentment at the grandchild's foolish deed. Ha! Yolki-palki! The bang did not come. The fleet in the port of Tallinn was not destroyed, and the road for Mammon into Tallinn was open. The number 8 bus drove to the stop. Julius climbed onto the bus to ride home. The singing riot. The bus passed the ancient Kadriorg Park, sinking into the greenery of venerable trees, left the monument towering on the seashore to the left, where a winged virgin had outstretched a cross for the protection of the souls of perished sailors, and continued its journey along the beautiful seashore. Julius opened the book again and tried to read. In the 1st century before the birth of Christ, a threatening slave revolt broke out in ancient Rome. The rebellion was raised by gladiators, foreign soldiers captured by the Romans and forced to kill each other in the circus for the people's amusement. Slaves and the poor country folk joined the gladiators. The uprising was led by the gladiator Spartacus, a man of powerful build and iron will. The Roman elite troops who went out against Spartacus were heavily defeated, and Spartacus's army grew every day. The rebels were already approaching Rome. Julius's reading was interrupted by the abrupt braking of the bus and the shouting and noise coming from outside. Julius raised his eyes and was terribly startled. The bus was surrounded by an immense crowd of people, all frolicking and screaming at the top of their lungs. There was an irrational number of people, nearly 1 million or even more. No beginning or end could be seen to their columns. From the latrine located across the road from the Rusalka monument, a pungent stench drifted over the crowd. A riot, Julius noted with fear. Julius was right. It was a singing riot. The country folk had had enough of the capital's posturing, the demagoguery of the optimates, the confusing laws of the Senate, the corruption of the populares, the edicts of the consuls that ignored the country folk, the slogans of the Communist Party and the bootleg vodka of the People's Party members.
Some also disliked Tullius's boasting at the midsummer bonfire and his lounging about in a loincloth with black African maidens. Often seen in his litter was no longer his young wife, but behind the already dark-tinted glass of the litter, one could notice a coal-black face, the flashing of brilliant white teeth and white eyeballs.
The country folk could endure it no longer. Also, many a countryman lusted after a dark-skinned girl in a loincloth. They rose up in a singing riot. Along the Pirita road toward the battlefield, the Song Festival grounds, moved the columns of rebels. At the very front strode the Seto women, chanting folk songs and waving their sarafan sleeves, silver conical brooches and neck coins on their high breasts, beads and silverware clinking threateningly. Lifting their close-fitting bodices and wide-skirted gowns high and dancing the Savikorja Russian, the column of East Viruma country women passed by. The Haryuma men in breeches and wadded suits, and the Haryu women in pot-blue striped skirts and pot hats, meanwhile, whirled in the Viru waltz. Protesting against the bankruptcy of the country folks' bank and the excesses of money power, the women of Rogosiu Rusmai, in Latvian patterned skirts, hip aprons, and headscarves, frolicked around the bus, and the men of Vatsalina, in long trousers and coats with red braiding, danced the merry Jew polka. The women of Saaremaa and Muhuma, in cross-striped skirts pleated with the help of hot loaves, in coifs supported by willow twigs, and in tar-soled slippers, attacked with the dollar bow, while the rebel ensemble from Surayani thrashed the Kairayan with their wrap skirts and long coats fluttering. The Moosjala women in colorful headscarves had grabbed each other by the hands and whirled in the Moosjala low. The men of Hanja, in sandals, danced the threatening Kigadi Kagadi, aided by the Kinu women in striped skirts, chintz jackets, and chintz headscarves, dancing the Kiladi Koladi. The Voro folk in smocked shirts even managed two protest actions, the Voro dance and the Voro polka. Troops from neighboring and even distant friendly lands had arrived to help the country folk. The Hungarians supported the country folk with a Chardash. The Russians thrashed a Novgorodskoye Gulianya, while the Germans, Essen Suite, and the Hutsuls, Korichka, were an effective aid at the decisive moment. The rebels' rear was covered by the flat foot for 6 pairs. The rebels moved slowly but surely forward toward the Song Festival grounds, though they were met with desperate resistance by High Consul Popular's legion, Magistrate Tullius's cohort, and Master Lepidos's maniple. The thinning ranks of Popular's legion, gathering their last strength, thrashed the staying-put polka. Tullius's cohort tried to offer resistance with the Tallinn dance, but it was in vain. Master Lepidos's maniple had begun the running polka. In a blind panic and confusion, Popular's legionaries and Tullius's troops followed them, retreating to the slope of the Song Festival grounds, trying to turn the strategic location to their advantage. Popular positioned the remaining loyal legionaries in the center of the hill. The right phalanx was supported by Magistrate Tullius at the head of his cohort, while on the left, Master Lepidos had lined up his troops. They were ready for the final, decisive battle. At this point, we take a small breather while the rebels are occupied with breaking down the gates of the Song Festival grounds, and we see what has become of Berenica and Emilius. How has it gone for them during the riot? The women's rights activists of Tartama, having heard of Berenice's sad story and exploiting the masses gathered for the riot, organized a fierce protest meeting on the square in front of the Sur Patare prison, demanding Berenice's release. Bowing to the pressure of the rebels and fearing for his life and office, the prison governor gave the order to release Berenice. Berenice was carried out of the prison gates on the hands of the rebels, while Emilius was chased away from the prison gate. Now, however, we return to the Song Festival grounds. The Yuri warbands, marching in the front ranks of the country folk, broke through the gates of the Song Festival grounds, and immediately a war cry was heard. Quiet at first, but ever growing. Oh, this wretched Vida perish, this distressed masters perish. Oxen ate while in the yoke, old nags while in the harness. In support of the jury warband, the Jurfi host intervened from the right flank. Oh, this wretched Kotla parish, this luckless Utra parish. The pipe calls there, the whip cracks there, crying was heard on the fields there. From the left, Simuna launched an attack. The devil's home thunders, hell's windows are burning, Judas's towers are dangling. Crying is heard in Nurmatuise, sorrow in Alutahahe. The women's wail from afar, the whips whistle to Viborg. More and more hosts entered the battle. The struggle became increasingly fierce. The sons of Kusalu fought with particular fury. High above sits the haughty one, high above the haughty's child, high above with eating, high above with drinking. The entire mass of rebels now launched an attack. The Hamuli host had broken through to the front of the Populaire Legion's ranks and fought at the top of their lungs. Where did that innkeeper get rich and get that great wealth? The beer mug was tilted. That's where that innkeeper got rich and got that great wealth. High Consul Populaire ordered the trumpet to be blown and directed his legion into a counterattack. Oh, you mad Hamuli folk, changeling, black shirt, who the devil called you here, wanted to see you for hunger's sake? Should have stayed in your own home, stood by your own wall side. The first ranks of the Hamuli host wavered. The Haryuyani rebels, startled by Popular's fierce attack, began to retreat in a panic. I went to Finland in secret. I went to Sweden to hide. In Finland, I became a great man. In Sweden, I became a rich man. I came back to Tallinn. Does this Tallinn want me? Does Tudulina know me? Will Voru city receive me? If Tallinn does not want me, nor Tudulina know me, Voru city does not receive me. At once, I'll head toward Latvia. I'll stride again toward Finland. Soon, toward the city of Vasa. High Consul Popula, emboldened by the retreat of the Haryuyani rebels, gave the signal for a general offensive. Tullius, Lepidus, and their troops pressed upon the countryfolk's hosts at the top of their lungs. I do not care for justice, nor fear the court's commands. I have justice under my wing, the court in my coat sleeve. If I am called to court, driven before the law, then I take justice from under my wing, and the court from inside my coat sleeve. We have much poll tax, terribly much yard tax. Have we any land left? If we had apple trees in our yard, deer trees at the end of the chamber, riddles, looms, berry trees, for apples we'd get silver money, a berry cup. That costs a lot. The situation was beginning to turn catastrophic for the country folk, but from the general retreat they were saved by the elders of Heljala, who had arrived in time with their hosts. The overseer is the devil's son, the bailiff the dappled harlot's son. Ate the flesh off my back, sucked the lard from my arse. From the belly he got cake fat, from the gut he got sausage fat. From the side he got candle fat, from the back he got soap fat. The Haryuyani host had managed to regroup in the meantime and launched a new offensive together with the Halyala men. All the assembled hosts and warbands joined them. "O you overseer, you dog-skin, the bailiff, the dappled harlot's cow, ate the soap fat off my back. From the groin you got cake fat, from the arse you got thick lard. O overseer, you devil's son, the bailiff, the dappled cow's son, the steward, the hound's son, ate 7 skins off my back, 8 skins off the neck, 9 skins off the shoulder, 10 skins off the side." The forces of High Consul Popula, Tullius, and Lepidus were crushingly defeated and forced to retreat in shame. The country folk, however, now began to dance and sing with abandon, cheering over their victory. Even I saw those days, saw those weeks, when the city of Riga was made. 10 churches were woven, old Tallinn was hewn, old Viljandi was whipped.
The Sangist girls, meanwhile, became entirely boisterous.
Maidens young, damsels nimble, for whom do you keep your lips, keep your fine face? Keep them to deceive the boy, to bait the grey shirt. The Audru girls set about supporting them, inciting the revelry, and soon a boundless song and chanting flowed over the song festival grounds, which refused to end even in the twilight. Village girls, sisters. Now is the leave to make merry, leave to live in merriment. Now there is no shutter of the mouth, no tear of the tongue, no holder of the rain branch, no keeper of the bridle stock, no putter-on of the bits. The bus lurched into motion. Julius rubbed his eyes. The vision vanished from his sight. At the song festival grounds, an immense crowd of people was singing and dancing, with beer caps in hand and plastic helmets with horns on their heads. Beer caps were clinked together, raised high, and then, as if performing some pagan rite, the beer was poured down the throat, accompanied by the cheers, shouts of praise, frolicking, and dancing of spectators and participants. Those who did not care to frolic or did not know how to dance tossed plastic bottles into the air and threw other rubbish, feeling themselves participants in the rite. Ola Summer! Beer summer, Julius realized. Julius turned his gaze toward the sea. Beautiful white cruise ships approached the port of Tallinn, while fast catamarans and hydrofoils were departing. Large cargo ships lay at anchor in the roadstead, casting long shadows on the quiet sea surface, shimmering in the red evening sun. Julius threw a glance backward at the city. The old and new buildings of the ancient city glinted nicely and friendly together in the setting sun. He noted with pleasure that the old town had preserved its beautiful, steep-gabled red-tile roofs, as if he had seen Lepidos's destruction of the old town roofs only in a dream. Suddenly, a high bank building with glass glinting in the evening sun caught his eye, with a gallows on top. Julius blinked his eyes as if in misunderstanding, smirking to himself, and turned his gaze back toward the sea. The bus reached the Maha Garden city stop. Julius strode home. Dulce domum. It is pleasant to come home. Acknowledgements and apologies. The author thanks the diligent collectors of folk customs and folklore, from whose fruit the author plucked some fitting pieces for this story. Nor can one overlook those political figures, businessmen, and officials whose self-sacrificing, though often humanly understandable, self-seeking activity provided the author with food for thought, only a tiny part of which found reflection in this tale. At the same time, the author reproaches no one for anything, nor incites envy, for molestum est ferre invidiam, sed multo molestius nihil habere invidendum. It is hard to endure envy, but it would be much harder if there were nothing to be envied. Simultaneously, the author extends apologies to those aforementioned figures whose bright image somehow remained unnoticed between the lines of this story. Yet, nec vixit male, qui natus moriensque fefelit. Nor has he lived badly, who was born and died in obscurity. I hope that I find forgiveness, for it is not possible to load all the riches of the world onto the back of a single donkey. Respectfully, Uido Truija, Anno Domini 2002, the third day of the month of Restoration of Independence. Thank you for listening. To discover more stories, follow the link in the description below.